Now, from the studios of Into Tomorrow in Miami, this is ITTV.
We came across a company that's working to improve drug development by combining insights from patients' personality with machine learning. So it caught our attention. It's certainly about tech, and we as consumers become patients periodically, hopefully not too often. But whatever can be done, I think, to help those kinds of connections has got to be helpful. So the Vice President of Business Development for Tools4Patient is Erica Smith. Erica Smith, thank you for coming on and joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It sounds very unique what you guys are doing. So tell me a little bit about the company Tools4Patient, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So our founders 8 years ago, when they started the company, recognized one very simple fact, that when clinical trials are run to develop drugs, and maybe let me just put this in context for the audience.
Please.
So as a reminder, any drug that finally reaches patients has to go through clinical testing and clinical trials, and this is done in 3 phases. And then the data is submitted for regulatory approval. And of course, this process takes several years. It can take 5, 6, 7 years. And it costs, quite frankly, billions of dollars. So anything that goes awry in that clinical development process, and there are many things that can happen, will prevent the drugs from reaching the patients that need them. And that was one of the motivations behind the foundation of Tools4Patient. So our founders recognized one simple fact, that when these clinical trials are conducted, they collect a lot of biological data. They might collect vital signs or blood work or medical images, but they fail to consider the patient as an individual. So we recognize that patients are people, that clinical trial subjects are actually human beings with a full spectrum of personality, psychology, with different beliefs and different motivations. So when you think about it, it makes a lot of intuitive sense, but this has not historically been considered in drug development.
Yeah, because I'm assuming, Erica, that a lot of those various aspects can affect the outcome of a drug trial in this example, right?
Absolutely. So consider, a very simple example. You can have one person that's an optimist, that has an optimistic perspective on the world, and maybe they come from a culture with a very strong belief in the power of medicines. And those two things are going to influence how that patient responds to drugs,
sure,
and even how that patient behaves in the trial, maybe how likely they are to take their medications versus not. And those are the kinds of things we are trying to better understand, use it by incorporating an understanding of patients' personality, motivations, beliefs, and expectations into the clinical data analysis.
And that sounds fascinating to me. I mean, obviously, you've got to take that into consideration. And yet, as you mentioned, that's not a part generally of clinical trials that can take many years, of course, unless you're a coronavirus vaccine, which could take only months. But the point is, those I can understand are some important factors. When we hear about all kinds of clinical trials, drug tests, various things, we also hear typically about placebos given to some in the group, because you've got to have some variables. So how does the placebo response, how is that affected by what you guys do? And why is it, for that matter, even an issue in drug development?
Absolutely. That's a great question. The gold standard of randomized controlled trials is comparing the response of the patients that receive drug to the response of the patients that receive placebo. And the reason this is the gold standard is because the placebo response is a very real and significant issue. So what the placebo response is, it's an improvement, a clinical improvement, an improvement of symptoms or disease in patients receiving only an ineffective or sham treatment, or that placebo or sugar pill. And when those patients have an improvement, it can muddy the waters in understanding whether the drug actually works. It's critically important to make sure that when a drug reaches patients, that it has benefit above and beyond the placebo response. And when there's a strong placebo response in the study, it muddies the waters, it creates noise in the data, and that makes it much more difficult to distinguish the real efficacy of the drug from just the response to placebo.
And quite frankly, my thought is that the pharmaceutical companies can't be too thrilled. Not that I'm concerned for them. They make enough billions of dollars. But the fact is that they've got to be concerned, because if they're getting better and wait, these people are on the placebo, they're not even taking our drug, then that's got to make them sort of panic. And I don't know that this would be the case, but maybe try to not produce as many results that way, or cover up some of those results, or say, well, that's skewed weird. I like how you called it, a sham product, because, I know you don't mean that in a negative way. It's a sham in the sense that it's not part of the drug. We just want to see how other people react to the same period of time and stuff. So it can get very confusing. So I'm thinking
absolutely
AI can play a role here that has never been played before.
Yeah, it really can. And the reality of the situation is that most drugs that enter clinical development never make it to patients. Only about 10 to 20% of drugs that enter phase 1 development become approved in the end. And about half the drugs that enter late-stage clinical development fail because they're unable to demonstrate efficacy. So that can come from one of two things. Either the drug doesn't work, which is unlikely at that late stage of the game, after a decade, maybe in many cases of research, or it may be because it's too difficult to show that it works because of this placebo response. So the end result is there are many potentially very good drugs that are abandoned because of this issue. And again, that prevents them from reaching the patients that really need them. So, really our focus is, and that's why the word patient is in the name. Our focus as a company is helping drugs reach the patients that are waiting for efficacious therapies. So yes, and we use AI to understand the psychological data and then integrate that into the clinical data analysis.
Gotcha. So I'm assuming then that's how Tools4Patient does its job. I understand you have something called the Place Bell. What is that, and how does that become part of the project?
Yep. So the Placebo approach is basically a way to predict each patient's placebo response. And we do that by first understanding the personality of the patient. We've spent years and years doing research on this to develop this tool. And essentially what we're trying to do is, as I said, build in this method to account for the fact that one patient may have a very strong response to placebo, and the next patient may have little or no response to placebo. And that difference creates noise in the data. So we're trying to account for that mathematically using machine learning and predictive modeling.
Gotcha. And obviously, my bad for looking at the word, because it's place bell, but I get it. It's placebo, right? For placebo type scenario. Now it makes sense. So I'm doing this. How is it that the placebo does its job? What is it that it does? Without getting too technical and too medical, because you're going to lose me and most of us, I think.
So we've developed a questionnaire that looks at key aspects of the patient's personality, their motivations, their beliefs, their perceptions, key components of that relate to placebo response. It's very easy to administer. It's sort of like a questionnaire you might find in a magazine, where there are simple statements and the patient just responds on a 5-point scale. So one of the questions might be, for example, I always worry about making mistakes when dealing with other people. And the patient then decides whether they agree, strongly agree, moderately agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Just 5-point scale. And it's and they're instructed to answer very spontaneously. And we take that information, and like I said, we've developed predictive models that consider that psychological information. They consider some other typical data collected at baseline, things like maybe how long the patient has had the disease for which they're being treated. We use that as inputs to our machine learning-based model. And then we worked with the statisticians that are analyzing the data from the trial. Of course, the statisticians are responsible for determining if the response in the patients that receive drug is significantly different than the response in the patients that receive placebo. And we help them to include this data in the analysis. And what we found is that it has a profound impact on reducing the risk of a failed trial if the drug is actually efficacious.
Wow. And what I think is fascinating is, like in the example you gave, clearly has nothing to do with perhaps the disease or the issue that the medication is required for, or the medication itself. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, why would they ask such a question? Well, again, it's because of the machine learning, this artificial intelligence that's hoping to put things together and make sense out of everything. I get how that can make a difference if you're asking a few questions
Absolutely.
like that, and where are they steered, how are they dealing with it? Now it's beginning to come together for me. So I'm assuming that
we sort of see the patient as a filter, right? They're getting all this information as part of the trial, and they're processing and filtering it, but they're doing that through the lens of their own individual personality, their experiences, who they are as an individual person, and that then is going to filter through and impact their response.
And because of the technology that you're using, I'm assuming that is what is able to help accelerate the delivery of a new medication to the market, for example?
Absolutely. So what we do is we try really hard and focus this technology on reducing the risk of failed trials. So essentially what that does is failed trials often have to be repeated. In many cases, companies may not be able or willing to repeat trials, so the drugs may be abandoned. If we reduce the risk of failed trials, we accelerate the delivery of medicines to the patient. And all in all, we can reduce the timeline and the cost of the development process.
Now, is this something I'm hearing my audience in my head saying, is this FDA approved? Does it need to be? Is it something that is just part of the overall process? And because it can accelerate things, is it looked at favorably? Or are you getting like, no, we're not rushing any of this? Well, you're not rushing it. It seems to me you're providing a lot more detail.
All it is more data, right? And more data helps the scientists and statisticians understand what actually happened in the trial.
Gotcha.
From a regulatory perspective, we're using a tried and true method that is used to account for lots of differences between patients. So when you have a diverse patient population that's in a clinical trial, you might have patients that have different ages or different genders, and there are statistical ways to account for that are accepted and widely used in clinical data analysis, and we've modeled this after that approach. So in that sense, it's really a tried and tested approach, and importantly, this approach has absolutely no risk. There's no risk to the regulators, so we're not doing anything to the data that would cause a regulator to approve a drug that doesn't work. There's no risk of that whatsoever.
Good.
And there's no risk that it can compromise the analysis of the data. So it's just additive. It's more information. It can only make things better.
Gotcha. So it's one of those win-win-win kinds of things. If you have more information, it's always better than not enough information, the way I look at it.
Of course.
Okay, terrific. Yep. And I'm looking on your website, Quantify the Impact of the Mind. Unlock insights into patient psychology to predict patient behavior and treatment response in clinical trials. Now, while that's not something that we as end users, as consumers, are going to necessarily deal with, but certainly others listening and you want to learn more, we invite folks to visit Tools4Patient.com. And of course, we'll get you there too when they visit our site. Erica, you are a delight to chat with, and thank you for not speaking over my head. I actually get it, what you're doing, and I think it's fascinating. I see a future question too that you could ask is, do you listen to Into Tomorrow? And if not, you should. Whatever, because you want to get everybody's mindset in the right way. But thanks so much for joining us, and we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much, Dave. It was a pleasure.
Our pleasure as well. Erica Smith, Vice President of Business Development for Tools4Patient.com. And when you visit us at intotomorrow.com, you're a mouse click away from Erica's site, and you'll see what she and her team are up to on a regular basis. Very fascinating what they're doing. So I hope that they continue that good work, and maybe, just maybe, we'd be able to get really good medicines to market sooner that could help many of us in various different capacities. I think that's awesome. Into Tomorrow continues right here. I'm Dave Graveline. Stay tuned on the Advanced Media Network.